Hello, and welcome to our second presentation in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute 2026 at the U Lecture Series. I'm Laura Peterson, an OLLI volunteer. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota is a vibrant learning community for people aged 50 plus. Part of the College of Continuing and Professional Studies, OLLI belongs to a national network of Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes supported by the Bernard Osher Foundation. I would like to acknowledge and say thank you to our sponsor, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. We also acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. Today's lecture is entitled The Power of Ordinary Magic. How do children overcome adversity? Our presenter is Dr. Ann Masten, who is the Regents Professor Emerita at the University of Minnesota's Institute of Child Development. She received her PhD from the University of Minnesota and is the author of Ordinary Magic, Resilience in Development. I will turn this over to you, Dr. Masten.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm a big fan of lifelong learning, still trying to be in that bucket myself. But I'm really thrilled to be able to speak to you about the research I've done over my entire career, which has been focused on resilience. And before I get going, I want to take you on a quickie journey to how I ended up at the University of Minnesota and in this area of research. I grew up in the military, and I experienced many families who were facing a parent away at war. My own father was away when I was a teenager in Vietnam, but I moved a lot. And the longest I lived anywhere growing up was when I went to college at Smith College. And from there, I went on to the National Institute of Mental Health as a research assistant. I was actually just a little gopher on that campus. But I was fortunate enough to meet Norman Garmezy, a professor at the University of Minnesota, while I worked there. He was close friends with my boss, and he loved to talk and find out what I was interested in. And he told me about his new research on children who overcome adversity. And I knew I wanted to go to graduate school in clinical psychology, and that the University of Minnesota had a wonderful program in that area. So off I went. He recruited me there, and I got my PhD in clinical psychology. I was only gone for 1 year to do a predoctoral internship required for that field of study. And then I came back for some postdoc research, and the best job in a couple of years when I went on the job market was about half a block down the road at the Institute of Child Development. Shown there in the bottom picture in the middle. That's the old building, and there's a picture of me on the playground of the old building. And I would stay there for the rest of my career. I knew it was a fantastic place to become a developmental scientist and share my ideas and train the wonderful students there. It's been renovated. We have a new building called Campbell Hall. I encourage you to visit it if you haven't seen it yet. It's a beautiful building. So while I was there, starting 50 years ago plus, I got engaged in research in this area, trying to understand how it is that kids are able to overcome adversity and what we can do to foster that kind of capacity in children as they grow up. I've studied many situations over the years, beginning with the Project Competence longitudinal study, which was a study of kids from the community to try to understand the life events they experienced and how they did. But I've also studied locally many years the risk and resilience that children face who experience homelessness with their families. I've also studied children who are war survivors and recovering after natural disasters, as well as refugees and immigrant youth, both in Minnesota and also in Greece, where I have a longstanding collaborator, another PhD from the Institute of Child Development. It was fun to visit Greece, I must say. But over the years, I began to realize there was a lot of consistency in what we were seeing in resilience in children in all these different situations. And what I want to do today is share with you Just the highlights. I just have limited time, and I have provided a handout that they're making available in the chat and they'll send out that has some resources for you, both the slide content and also resources if you want to learn more about this topic. I want to highlight why I study resilience as well as many other people around the planet, what to me resilience means, how I define it, and why I prefer a broad definition, what we know about what matters for resilience of children, both broadly and a few specific examples from some of the research I've done, and what the implications of what we've learned about resilience in children, what are those implications for what we do to nurture children and protect them in the now and for the future, kids who are facing a lot of adversity. And I think this topic has become more and more urgent because we, over the many years, have seen an increasing number of large scale adversities facing children. I'm going to talk about some of them today, but I'm sure you all are getting the sense that there's many threats around the world to children. And right now, I think we're all keenly aware of issues pertaining to deportation, pertaining to children in conflict zones. We have more refugees now than we've ever had before in human history, some displaced internally, some moving to other countries. But we also have a rising number of disasters, and we're going to see more as the climate becomes more and more unstable. And of course, we've all recently been through the pandemic. And meanwhile, our problems with poverty and homelessness have continued. So this is a topic that I think is really important for all of us to think about. Resilience throughout the lifespan, but I'm going to focus on resilience in children. Kids are particularly vulnerable to some of these changes. We know that with climate, for example, kids are particularly sensitive to heat effects. They're also sensitive to the toxic substances that occur during wars, not ranging from radiation to other kinds of residuals from bombs, as well as the psychological threats and the threat of being separated from your caregivers or orphaned, that sort of thing. I want to go back to another turbulent time to talk about some of the origins of resilient science. World War II was, of course, a catastrophe for children as well as adults around the world. Children were affected in many different ways. They were orphaned. Many were killed or incarcerated in concentration camps. Kids were starving in many areas of Europe after World War II. And during the war, many people who were cared for children in nurseries, as well as psychologists and psychiatrists, began to really talk about and write about the impact of trauma and adversity on children. Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter, who had moved to England, ran nurseries for war-affected children. She also would take in some of the children who were released from concentration camps at the end of the war. She wrote a book on children and war in the middle of World War II. And there were also some very important young people who were affected by the war who would contribute to the start of resilient science. I think most people date the systematic study of resilience to the period around 1970. And these three people were the pioneers. Norman Garmezy was one of them. He was the person I, of course, came to Minnesota to work with in the early days of resilient science. And he had been a soldier in World War II. I think, he was at the Battle of the Bulge, a young infantry soldier, and that had a profound effect on him. But he became one of the early clinical scientists and eventually ended up at the University of Minnesota. Emmy Werner was one of the young adolescents who survived the bombing of Europe and would experience the outreach of many people around the world through the foundation of UNICEF, emergency funds for kids, and care packages arriving to Europe. She wrote a beautiful book later on about from the perspective of children with first-person accounts by children who experienced World War II. She grew up to be the principal investigator of one of the most famous longitudinal studies of resilience, followed a birth cohort in Hawaii, the island of Kauai, from 1955 all the way for decades. And Emmy had a profound effect on our understanding of resilience. And the third one here is Michael Rudder. He was one of the kids he was the youngest in these pictures. He was evacuated during the war, during the Blitz, from England to the United States, a sea evacuee, as they call them. And he spent World War II with a Quaker family in the United States for safety reasons. He would grow up to be the world's most famous child psychiatrist, and he was very interested, along with these others, in understanding initially the origins of mental health problems and how did adversity in childhood influence the risk for mental health issues. But what these three have in common is that as they began to undertake serious research on kids at risk for various reasons, they began to realize that there were a lot of kids out there who were doing okay even though they experienced adversity. And they all became, intrigued with this issue and realized how important it was for intervention. Because for years and years, people had studied kids at risk and, the origins of mental health problems with very little focus on what makes a difference to protect children from risky circumstances, or how do kids overcome adverse childhoods, grow up to be just doing fine and contributing to society and to healthy parents themselves. So they started a movement really to try to understand how it is that some children are able to weather the storm and develop successfully even though they experience adversity. What makes a difference? Now, in the case of major disasters, the pandemic, and children in conflict zones, and what we're going to face with climate change around the world, it's important to think of large-scale disasters. And I think I wanted to really mention here what a wake-up call it was to experience a pandemic. And I think we began to see the broad spreading of a tiny little virus you couldn't even see brought the world to a halt. And there were cascading effects. It was devastating, of course, for many adults as well as children. And what you see in the picture here is a roller coaster, what looks like a roller coaster. These are the pictures that the New York Times used to publish frequently, like once a week. They put out a new diagram of the rate of new infections, the rate of hospitalizations, the rate of deaths from the virus. And there was also an emotional roller coaster. I'm sure many of you experienced the ups and downs of what it was like to cope with the adversity everybody was experiencing during the pandemic. It's easier to measure the infection rate and the hospitalization rate than it is to measure what was going on in all the families and kids around the world. But there are a lot of lessons to be taken from this experience. We had to mobilize a response to deal with COVID that was multi-system in nature, ranging from dealing with our immune systems. We had to create vaccines and treatments for people who were having horrible reactions to the virus or to protect them from the virus. We also, though, had to figure out how to socially distance, how to learn from a distance, how to keep supply chains going, how to boost up a healthcare system to deal with millions of casualties, how to transmit information safely, who to trust, and so forth. There were multiple system threats, and there had to be a multiple system response. And we did better in some areas than we did in others. But I think it's important to think about the fact that a lot of the situations children are facing now in the world on a large scale are more like the pandemic. I mean, they are multi-system threats, and they are going to require multi-system responses and preparation. And that's the really the crux of the reason that I think it's important we define resilience in a way that it is workable to scale it up, to use it for multiple disciplines and multiple responses from a like a molecular level and inside the body health perspective to all the systems around people that have to be mobilized in order to overcome many kinds of adversity. So this is the definition I like of resilience. It applies to any dynamic system with the idea that we have to pool what we know from different disciplines to really respond and get ready for some of the challenges in front of us. So I think of resilience as the capacity of a system. I focus a lot of my work on cute systems like the one in this picture, a child, but you can also think of the family as a system, the community as a system. These are very complex systems, an economy, a society. But the capacity of a system to adapt successfully to challenges that threaten the function, survival, or development of that system, usually through many processes and multiple system interactions. We know that children depend on many systems, not only for their development, but also for their resilience when they face adversity. And in the picture here, you see a little diagram of the interconnected systems. This is from a paper on schools, so it has a little school bent to it. But what you see there at the bottom is represented in the diagram as a child with a little blue circle. And inside the child are systems that I haven't represented here, such as the immune system, your cardiovascular system, your neuroendocrine system, all of which are operating to protect us in different ways internally. But a child is also, when they're growing up, interacting with the family system and the people in that system in a home. They're also interacting with people in the neighborhood. They go to child care, they may go to preschool, and then as they get older, kids go to school and they're part of classrooms and school systems and they interact with many other people. And there are policies and community activities that affect what's happening in schools and affect the lives of children, even though they may never meet a policymaker. So if you think about all these interactions, you begin to see that this is a very dynamic process, and I haven't even represented time here. But what I want to emphasize is that from a systems perspective, resilience is always changing. It's dynamic, it's fluctuating, and I bet many of you experienced that the fluctuations of your own resilience during the pandemic, where some of the time you may have been energized to, try to meet the demands of juggling everything like distance learning for your kids and work and whatever. But at the same time, sometimes you get exhausted. Sometimes the treatments themselves are exhausting, and then you need to recover and build up your capacity again. But resilience is distributed, and many systems bolster up children when they're threatened by adversity. What we think of as individual resilience actually depends on the resilience of other systems too, like the resilience of the parents, for example, for a child, or the school district, or whatever. And because of this, multi-system thinking is important. And it's going to be very important when we're dealing with things like, climate change and the disasters that begin to happen as a result of that. So what have we learned about risk and resilience in children? What really matters? And here's a broad list of what matters. Certainly the nature of the adversity, the severity, the frequency, how many risk factors are piling up in your life. We learned pretty quickly that often kids experience multiple threats at the same time, or they pile up in their lives. Kids who grow up in poverty, for example, often experience many other kinds of adversity related to being impoverished, ranging from food insecurity to dangerous neighborhoods. But other things affect the resilience of children and the risks they're exposed to, their background, the history of the family, individual differences. Some children are more sensitive biologically and some more sensitive psychologically to experiences of trauma or adversity. But there are many other systems, relationships, families, friends, community influences that affect how children do, and as well as many cultural supports that have been recognized over a long period of time now. I wanted to illustrate this little piece of data from a study of kids who were staying in a shelter for homeless families. These are 8 to 10-year-olds in this diagram. And these kids, what we did was measure the number of well-established risk factors. These are big risk factors for children having some behavior problems and also other kinds of problems like academic achievement problems. And this doesn't even count being homeless. These were all children experiencing homelessness. But if you just count them up and then measure how they're doing on mental health symptoms or behavioral problems, what you see is that higher risk, a higher count of risk factors is related to more problems. And that's called the risk gradient. And the individual child represented by the red dot there has a very high level of problems, probably would really benefit from a referral, for example, on this measure. But that's average for people with this really high level of risk. On the other hand, there are yellow dots there that represent children who are in very high risk categories but are doing well. And it was those children who were doing well despite their exposure to adversity and risk that really intrigued the resilience researchers. How do we account for that? Here's another picture of risk and resilience. This is from reading scores. This is a much larger study collaborating with the Minneapolis Public Schools. They measure reading achievement at the time this was done, reading and math achievement annually using a nationally standardized test. And in the middle of the picture, you'll see like the average score on this test. And it's designed to show growth. So you see it rises over time because kids do get better at reading and math over time. So these are reading scores. And we divided all the kids who had scores every year or every other, whoever we had from third grade to eighth grade. And if this is over a longitudinal window, we put all their scores in and looked at the average scores for the kids on the bottom who had experienced homelessness. Turned out to be a rather shocking 14% of all the students who were enrolled in those grades in the Minneapolis schools at the time. Very high, but there's a lot of homelessness in the urban areas now and then. And what you can see is on average, they started at the 12th percentile on this national test, and they really stay behind on average throughout this whole time. But they're doing significantly worse than the kids who are living in poverty who've never been homeless, called the free meals group. Large number of kids in urban districts are qualified for free meals due to low income. And you can see they're doing better. They start off at 21%, but they're still significantly below the average on this national reading test. Kids who have less poverty, lower cost meal qualified, track the average. And then you have the low-risk kids in this picture. These are kids who have never experienced homelessness that we know of in this window, and they also weren't qualified. Their family didn't qualify for low-cost meals. So that's not a very high qualification to be low risk, but you see it makes a huge difference. The kids in the low risk group start at the 75th percentile on this standardized test, and they stay up there. And what you're looking at is this huge achievement gap that you've probably heard about in particularly evident in metro areas like this one. But that's not the whole story, because again, the variation is hidden in pictures like this. Now, because if you just look at the kids in that bottom group, 3,000, more than 3,000 kids were in that group. Look at them as individuals. What you begin to see, you see a spaghetti plot on the bottom right. That spaghetti plot is shows that there's a huge variation in how kids are doing, and some kids are doing very well. Close to half of the children in that group experiencing homelessness score in the average range on both reading and math along the way, whereas other kids are doing very, very poorly. There's tremendous variation, which again raises the question, well, why is there so much variation? How do we account for that? Why are some kids doing so much better than other kids, even though they may share some of the same adversity? Well, we have been very interested in a number of um, differences that could explain some of this variation that might give us clues about what we could do. And we've been particularly interested in cognitive development and the learning skills that kids have, their school readiness. And I'm just going to show one example here. Child skills make a difference, and the skills that kids bring to the table. We've studied in particular executive function skills. These are the skills you're using to listen to this talk, paying attention, even though you might be thinking about your vacation or lunch or something, trying to pay attention. But there are many neurocognitive processes that make it possible for us to direct our attention, our planning, our thoughts in order to reach our goals. And these are very important skills for young children. They develop rapidly in the preschool years, and kids need these skills to do all right as preschoolers and when they enter school. They make it possible for kids to pay attention, to shift from one task to another, to follow instructions, to sit on the circle and wait in the line, and all those other little things you need to do to learn effectively in school. And we find if we measure these skills directly with little various measures shown there in the picture, we can follow kids and see how well they're doing, either in preschool screening or how well they're doing when they go to school. And we see it makes a big difference. These are very good predictors on how you do on these tests, are very good predictors for how you do later in school, reported by teachers or tested later. We've also worked closely with the Minneapolis Public Schools in their screening program to add measures of executive function to see if they predict benchmark testing later on. So we helped them with that and found that if we measured executive function skills during screening, that we could see down the road when the benchmark testing occurred in third grade that these are very important predictive skills. The kids who had high executive function scores are doing really well on achievement in third grade by benchmark testing, and the kids who are struggling with those skills have many more problems. They're not meeting the state standards. One of the reasons we were really interested in these skills is that they are malleable. And there's a group of people at the University of Minnesota, including Professor Phil Zalazzo and Stephanie Carlson, who I've collaborated with, who have been critical leaders in the research on executive function. And we work together to develop an intervention to try to boost executive function skills in very young children, particularly kids who are living in shelters and highly mobile children. And those efforts are successful. But it's also the case that high quality early childhood education and preschool programs are really great at shaping these skills as well. We also have been very interested in parenting quality. Parenting quality is one of the most important ingredients for resilience in children. And in children experiencing homelessness, we repeatedly found that measuring it in various different ways, that parenting quality was a very important predictor, not only of behavior and mental health, but also of academic functioning. And we found even with families staying in a shelter, there were parents who were very concerned about their kids' education, very involved, and were ready to ensure that they went to school and did as well as possible, and their children did better. We also could see, even though we measured it different ways, that parenting quality was an important buffer of risk and adversity. Parenting quality always matters for kids. It's a very good predictor of positive development in general, but it really matters when there's a lot of adversity, and particularly in situations like homelessness, where the parent is one of the main adults in your life who can protect you from some of the adversity kids are experiencing. I want to pause now for just a couple of minutes and talk more specifically about a single case. I've been talking about, research studies involving multiple kids and families, but I think that it's important to consider the individual case as well. And I wanted to share one experience with you that I had as a clinician, which I think illustrates in a very powerful way the power of caregiving. I was part of a team a number of years ago that was an inpatient team that worked to help with children having serious issues. And I was involved on a case study of a child I'm calling here Sarah. That's not her real name. But Sarah was admitted to the hospital when she was 2.5 years old because she was having not only strange behaviors, but she had fallen off the growth charts, in effect. She had basically stopped growing. Her height, weight, and head circumference were below the second percentile, and her pediatrician, her healthcare folks were becoming very concerned about her. Well, she was admitted. People wanted to know what's going on here. Does she have medical issues? Does she need to be institutionalized, or can she be adopted? That is a critical question for a young child. Our team was kind of shocked by the question, in fact, because it makes you realize that this child has reached a critical juncture, and it's really important. We did a multidisciplinary evaluation and learned about her history. There was great documentation on her history because she was in the child welfare system. And what we learned was that she had been born to a high-risk parent who had mental health problems and was placed in foster care right after she was born because her parent couldn't care for her. And the foster family worked really well for her. She bonded with them. She developed well across the board. She was growing normally. She was developing normally. And then catastrophe occurred. Her foster father died suddenly around when she turned 1. And then her foster mother was unable to cope very well. She was overwhelmed by the loss of her husband and taking care of foster kids. So when this child was 15 months old, her foster mother had called the welfare department and had them pick her up and move her to a new family. And little Sarah was picked up by a stranger, brought to another stranger, and she went into a developmental tailspin in reaction to this experience. That's a catastrophe for a child of this age. And things didn't go very well. This child was probably in such difficult shape that she needed special care, and the foster family just couldn't provide that for her, the second family. So she was hospitalized to check on whether there was medical issues for her or whether she could be adopted. We quickly concluded there were no medical evidence to explain her growth failure other than maybe eating less than she should be because she was sad. But we recommended as a multidisciplinary team that she be adopted to what we would call a forever home. And if that possible, could that be arranged straight out of the hospital? Because we could see that she'd been traumatized, and what she needed was stability and really good caregiving. And a wonderful social worker located an ideal family for her. We basically wrote a prescription for a new family, and she filled it. And that's probably the only time in my life that I've ever had that kind of experience. She responded beautifully to adoption and rebounded onto normal growth curve and across the board. You can see it in her growth chart here that she rebounded to height and weight, but she also developmentally rebounded. And we followed her over the years, and she has continued to do well. Teachers and schools also matter, and I think this is probably well known to all of you. There are many case examples where people describe the importance of a particular teacher in their resilience. But schools also and teachers also provide a very broad environment and positive experiences for development in schools, in classrooms. And schools serve multiple functions in the lives of many kids. Kids who come from very troubled families may find a safe, protective environment in schools, for example. But schools also are a powerful symbol of returning to normal life. So, in the wake of natural disasters like a tsunami or terror attacks or war zones, getting school going is often a very powerful symbol. I was involved in some research after Katrina in the Ninth Ward, and it was clearly crucial for school to get going to help normalize the lives of the children. But even when there's not a catastrophe, schools play a major role in nurturing the resilience, aptitudes, and capacities, both from a relational point of view and from individual problem-solving skills and self-regulation skills and so forth. So schools play an important role in many societies in developing, nurturing resilience in kids and preparing them for future adversity they may face. Well, we've had decades of research, and what people like me began to realize over time is that even though we were doing research on many different kinds of situations with different kinds of people, research was coming in from different cultures, different kinds of adversity. But at the same time, we kept seeing the same protective factors reported. Research was pointing to a very similar list of what matters in answer to that question. And most of the research in the early days was focused on psychological and social factors that you could measure in a child's life. Now we're seeing a lot more neurobiological measures, and there'll be down the road sometime a short list that matches maybe with neurobiological factors. But the early research pointed to this list, and I've nicknamed it the short list. And what we're looking at are the most commonly reported in diverse studies protective factors that are associated with resilience in kids facing adversity at many different ages. And of course, not all of these matter at the same age. Infants have different needs than older kids. Hope, faith, and optimism are critical for kids and older and adults. But infants, what's really critical is caregiving and having a sensitive caregiver. But these factors have been observed in many different studies over the years. And I'm hoping that if you think about people in your own life experience who've shown resilience, that you would recognize these as important protective factors. And I refer to these, the processes that underlie these protective factors as ordinary magic, because what they implicate are ordinary but powerful processes that are part of our human legacy, product of evolution, both biological and cultural evolution. They're associated with resilience because they've evolved that way. They've been selected because they work. And cultures and societies over time have recognized the importance of these protective factors. Many of these are also vital for ordinary good development, and many of them are important whether you have high risk or low risk. And for that reason, these are important targets for public health efforts to bolster not only positive development, but resilience as well. And some of these you see at all ages. Close relationships are important across the lifespan. Some emerge in development, like having a sense of purpose and belief life has meaning becomes important as you get older. Kids respond well to positive routines and rituals and cultural celebrations. But effective schools, once kids do go to school, being engaged and connected with effective schools is a very powerful protective factor as well. So these reflect many processes, but this list is really robust. And what I began to realize as research developed over time and spread from focusing on individual children to focusing on families and communities and schools, there are people, researchers out there who study resilience in schools and resilience in communities. And that what was striking to all of us over time as we compared notes is that this very similar list of protective factors were coming up. So you could see that, it looks like very similar processes, these fundamental adaptive systems that are the big drivers of positive development as well as resilience, mattered at when you looked at families as a whole system, at communities. And you can see this in cities, for example, when there's a picture here of Joplin High School. Somebody changed the wording to hope after the tornado destroyed the school. After the Boston Marathon bombing, there was this whole motto developed about Boston Strong. People wore their t-shirts. They still refer to Boston Strong at the Boston Marathon. There is a community mobilization of collective response that mobilizes a lot of these protective factors. When the war in Ukraine broke out, there was a lot of international support. People demonstrated their support by wearing yellow and blue and by lighting up their monuments with yellow and blue lights. This was a picture of our bridge in Minneapolis being lit up. And I think it's interesting to contemplate why we see the same protective factors at different system levels. And I think it's because that's the way they work. Human beings are very social, and we can mobilize a lot more capacity for resilience when we collectively put our efforts together. Well, children can't wait for us and scientists to figure everything out. And so it's important to translate research, like research on resilience, for the here and now. People realized this from the very beginning, even when there were pioneers, that as the research came out, it informed people's efforts to try to help kids who are facing threats and dangers now. And you try to use the best evidence you can to inform your policy, your interventions, and refine it as the research comes in. But if you have a child in a refugee camp or a shelter who's been traumatized, you want to be able to support the recovery and resilience of that child with the best knowledge that you can muster, even though that may be refined in the future. One of the results of the resilience science collectively was that over time, a framework for action developed that was built on what we were learning about resilience. And I think that the science had a transformative effect broadly on practice. And what in the early days of practice, there was a lot of focus on risk and problems and almost no mention of protective factors and positive influences that could be mobilized to help people. Now, I think good clinicians always did some of this, but what changed was the way people conceptualized their policies and practices to try to help kids. And this has been widespread. It has shifted the focus and broadened it from just risk and problems to a much more strength-focused approach, building capacity at multiple levels. And you can see it in many different disciplines, not just in psychology, for example, but also in disaster response, in social work and counseling, school psychology, psychiatry, and pediatrics, for example. And it really brings the sort of thinking about resilience from the research to practical applications. I'm just going to give two illustrations, and you can read more about this in some of my work if you're interested. One is that we began to measure positive as well as negative experiences. It's not just negative life events or what nowadays people often call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that affect development, but also positive experiences affect development. And now there are efforts to measure positive as well as negative experiences. One of our graduates from the University of Minnesota, Angela Narayan, who's a professor at the University of Denver, developed a measure called the benevolent childhood experiences. So you can measure BACEs as well as ACEs, and it's what was quickly been adopted in many places around the world. Having a caregiver with whom you felt safe, for example, is a positive childhood experience. And she has shown, along with many others, that it makes a difference what positive experiences you have. The research on resilience also implicated three basic strategies for intervention that I think was kind of a helpful framework. And locally, some of our most powerful multi-system efforts to help build resilience in kids try all three strategies. They combine them. So do many of our most effective humanitarian agencies around the world, those who are trying to help kids in war zones, for example. The three basic strategies are lowering the amount of risk and adversity kids experience occurring during and following, acute events. It really matters how much adversity you continue to experience, and how do you try to buffer against that. The second strategy is boosting resources and opportunities that are positive for kids. And the third is trying to mobilize those big drivers of resilience, the powerful but ordinary processes that I've called ordinary magic. And here's some examples for you. And I can't talk about them all, obviously, but just to give you a few examples, I knew from the beginning, even before I studied homelessness, that it wasn't good for kids to experience homelessness. So preventing homeless episodes is important. And there's a lot of different ways you can try to do that. We have in Minnesota, we have a crisis in the Twin Cities, a crisis nursery that's very effective in providing respite services for parents, in addition to child welfare services, trying to prevent child maltreatment. We advise people now when there's, horrible things going on internationally or on television to be careful what children are watching. I remember during 9/11, there's good research showing that young children who watched the 9/11 terror attack over and over on TV because their parents had it on were affected by that kind of media exposure. And we have so much social media now that kids can be exposed to. But we also now in many hospitals around the world screen for postpartum or maternal depression, because having a very depressed mother is risky for children. So we try to screen and treat for that in many different situations now. These are just some examples. There are many examples of increasing resources. We did a lot of that during COVID. We had to bring food to kids. There were a lot of kids who, without going to school, didn't have enough food to eat. They also didn't have internet service to do their distance learning. We had to provide resources like that. But a lot of the financial supports, rental assistance, free meals at school, scholarships for high quality childcare, these are examples of bringing more resources to children. And then the third strategy includes, where you're trying to mobilize powerful adaptive systems. You want to make sure to reunite families, to restore good caregiving if kids lose it. Sarah had lost good caregiving and it needed to be restored. It wasn't totally easy to restore it, and it was rare to be able to do that, but it had a very powerful effect on her life. When kids experience war zones, get separated from families, or lose their parents, it's really important to restore caregiving and adult care. School engagement and belonging is another important example. In Minnesota, Sandra Christensen and her group created Check and Connect, which is a great strategy for reducing truancy and promoting school engagement. That's another example. The nurse home visiting program targets parenting, trying to increase the bonding and support young parents during the early years after a child is born. There are many, many examples, and we have done a lot of evidence that interventions to support parenting can make a big difference in the lives of kids. Here's some campus examples. I don't have time to talk about them. I'll just show you these that, campuses think this way too. At the University of Minnesota, we try to reduce risk, boost resources, and strengthen protective systems for our students, staff, and faculty. And I'll let you ponder that. The greatest dangers for children are when some of the most fundamental protective systems are harmed, destroyed, or unavailable. And that's why it's important to restore them. But a lot of a lot of the most severe adversities undermine the most important protective systems for kids. And, we've learned that you can intervene, you can do something about it, but sometimes it's very difficult. When faith or hope is shattered by betrayal, for example, of a trusted adult, it's not easy to deal with that. I want to share a few cautionary notes and then make some closing comments. First of all, no child is invulnerable. Some conditions are so terrible, no child would be expected to flourish. On the other hand, children need some experience with manageable challenges and stress. Just like our human immune systems don't optimize without some exposure to germs and some vaccines, kids need some experience learning how to handle stress and how to manage adversity, learn what they can do, learn how to get help, and learn who to turn to if they need extra help. That's important. And it's important in the aftermath of a war zone. We may want to rebuild right away a school, but you've got to dig up the landmines first. And I think, keeping an eye on the damage that needs to be fixed too is important. We also know that if you're constantly straining to do well, you can succeed at school and at work and so forth, but it can have a biological cost on your body. You may have experienced some of that, but you can wear yourself out developmentally as well. I also want to mention that and have you think about many examples you've experienced directly or what you might think about next time you read an autobiography, biography, or watch a documentary or listen to a podcast about people who have overcome adversity. Some are famous, some are not. But the voices of resilience, there are powerful stories of resilience out there that I think reflect many of the ordinary magic processes. Some are unique because all situations are unique, but there's a lot of commonality in the stories of resilience to really difficult experiences. Two documentaries I wanted to mention. The new documentary of that Elizabeth Smart helped to produce and speaks in, Kidnapped on Netflix. Her book was also very powerful, but there's something particularly powerful about listening to her, and that was a very well done documentary. And another one I wanted to mention that University of Minnesota faculty were involved in, including myself, is Ida's story. You can find this free online. It's a story of a family of 7 Jewish children who survived persecution, lost both their parents in World War I, and they wandered around Ukraine for 2 years in danger and escaped finally, and then immigrated to the U.S. All 7 made it. Ida participated in this documentary, and it's all about resilience. When she participated, I never met her. She passed away before I was included, but she tells her story herself at the age of 92. So here's my takeaways. Resilience develops and changes. Many systems contribute. There are powerful human adaptive systems. It doesn't require something rare and extraordinary for resilience, but those systems are really important. We can nurture, boost, and protect the resilience of children, but it can also be depleted, and you probably felt that. There's ups and downs. Resilience is dynamic. And we need to focus more on multi-system resilience. The future resilience of all our societies depends on realizing the potential of young people for resilience. And it's pretty clear with the adversities facing us collectively on the planet and for the children who will be dealing with a lot of difficult situations in the future, that they're going to need all the resilience that they can build as they develop. Thank you for listening. Thank you for using your executive function skills to listen to this presentation. And I want to thank you all who are doing whatever you can to foster resilience of children in these turbulent times. It's certainly been a difficult year in Minnesota. I also want to thank the participants and my students and collaborators and all the funders who've made resilience research possible. And I'm going to stop there and see what questions there may be. Should I turn off my slides now?
Actually, I was going to ask if you could put up the slide with the list of books on it while we chat with questions so that people can take note of those, maybe for
Yeah,
a bit.
they're on the handout too.
Oh, okay, great.
All the slide content is on the handout that I've created. Some of the pictures aren't there, but the content of the slides is all on the handout, along with some more resources that you can click on. Most of those are free, so you can take a look at those.
Great, thank you. Um, so to start us off, I have a few questions. How does this sort of information that you've shared get into the hands of legislators in Minnesota? Do they have to come to you and ask for it, or is there another mechanism? Because
Well,
this just,
there are some mechanisms. I've done some testimony for the legislature over the years, and in some cases, that was facilitated some of the time by a university a person who was, connected with the legislature. Sometimes it was facilitated, like I've collaborated a lot with the public schools and with state agencies that deal with homelessness in children, and they've sometimes asked me to come speak. I've spoken to the Interagency Council on Homelessness as well as, a legislative session where they're dealing with trying to figure out what they want to do. But, I've tried to be responsive to that because I think it's very important to get the messages out. We also have a lot of students who get involved in, advocacy, both while they're graduate students and when they graduate and become either clinicians or policymakers themselves. And of course, the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota is a graduate of the Institute of Child Development. She majored in our department as an undergraduate. So there are many avenues, but I think that's important to play a role when you're invited. I've done that locally at the state level, done it in the community. When I've always thought it's really important to give back and with your collaborators. I mean, to talk. I've collaborated a lot with shelters in the Twin Cities and also with the public schools and early childhood. And when we were doing the early childhood screening project, uh, they helped us design it, and we, tried to answer their questions, and they contributed to the research, and then we shared it with them, and they have co-authored. Some of the folks who worked with us have co-authored our papers. I think papers by researchers are much more translatable when people from on the ground have been involved from the very beginning. I think that's been important in the kind of research that I do. But I've also given talks to congressional level people, U.S. Policymakers, and talks at the UN, and you try to give talks when you have a window to the degree it's possible. I also wanted to
well,
mention one more thing I wanted to mention. I do have the university was wanted to have MOOCs, mass open online courses that were given by university professors, and I volunteered to do that because that reaches a much broader audience. People from 180 plus countries around the world have participated in the MOOC, and there's links to that also on the resource list, and you can watch that for free. And there's lots of, it isn't just me talking. There's case examples and recordings and other things that I think, and that's a different way of sharing. I mean, I've had people take that course, and I still actively participate in the discussion forums, but people have taken that course like from a refugee camp, or from, you know, a place I've never heard of where, they have electricity only part of the time, but they join in to learn and understand and contribute their stories about resilience.
Well, are there any resources that you can point us to that we can use with our own local legislators or our national legislators to share this information with them? I know your book would be excellent, but I'm thinking of something that
Something a little
might
more readable,
more, well, just more
shorter.
concise for them,
Yeah,
more like
yeah.
bullet points.
Yeah, there are some materials like that, not just by me, but by other people as well. And there's some wonderful materials at the National Child Traumatic Stress Center. There's, with the ICE situation in the Twin Cities, there's been a lot of wonderful materials put out by local people who are, pooled their knowledge to create materials for people dealing with specific issues, because there's a wide range of issues. The situation in Minneapolis may be different than the situation in a war zone in the Middle East right now, for example. So, but I think people are making a real effort to, share helpful documents. There's a lot online that's concise, and I've put out things like that, but so have many other people as well.
Great. I just personally find this fascinating. I haven't been exposed to this kind of information before, and so it was very educational for me, I'm sure for our listeners as well. And I think children are truly the canaries in the coal mine here for our society, personal opinion. Um, so, oh, I guess to finish off this particular subject of questions, how do you think the current administration has impacted children? Funding, immigration surge, et cetera. I don't even know if that's really answerable in,
Well, it's complicated. It's very
yeah,
complicated.
yeah.
It's not just, yeah, the current, there's been, I just think we generally in this country we don't have enough support for families and parents. And, compared to other wealthy countries, we have so much less support for families to have not only health care, but child care and parental leave and things like that. For the wealth we have accrued in this country, I don't think we have enough support for everybody who becomes a parent. We have some wonderful programs, individual programs like, we have early childhood learning programs, and, communities have wonderful programs, but nationwide, we don't generally have, in my view, enough support for families, for parenting, for juggling and balancing work and childcare, and so forth. So I think it's a broad problem. And it's been around for a while, but I don't think it's getting any better. We need more support. I mean, there are families that aren't having children because they can't afford childcare and they can't afford housing. Well, that's not what we want. Don't want people to not have children because they feel they can't afford it and they don't have enough support for it. So I think it's a general problem. And, I think some countries do better than we do on this sort of thing.
How do you and your fellow researchers protect yourselves from the painful impacts of working with these traumatized children?
Well, sometimes it's difficult. And, part of your training, I think, I'm a child clinical psychologist, and part of your training, helps you learn how to deal with that. You have to have your own support system. You have to have some, have some boundaries, but it can be difficult. I found it particularly difficult to, um, you know, spend time in shelters. I've always thought it's important if you're going to do research that in a sense you're collaborating with families who are staying in a shelter. I've never experienced homelessness, and it's important to, be comfortable in the environment and get to know people. And the same is true of the students who were on the teams who studied homelessness. We volunteered to learn. We always had focus groups with parents so they could share with us. But it was difficult. And if you sometimes I'd get a call from a graduate student collecting data in a shelter, and I'd need to go in because, they're meeting with a parent who's clearly depressed. And, there certain situations are an emergency, and then, you have to go in and respond. And it's really difficult to see and experience and hear the stories from people who are living in extreme poverty in a country this wealthy as this one, or who've survived the trauma of migration from war zones, or who've lost everything, I visited Japan, where I spent some time as a child, but I visited after the tsunami. And it's pretty devastating to see what a major earthquake and tsunami does. The whole community I lived in when I was a child was just washed away, and they were rebuilding. But, it is very difficult. But, I haven't experienced the kind of terrible things that people have. I've had a parent at war, but I didn't lose that parent. And I've been tried to be a, thoughtful researcher in these very difficult situations. One of the things I found most important in my work is that because we have always, in my group and many of my colleagues, always focused on learning what helps, learning about resilience, families have been very supportive in general of the work that we do. We tell families we really trying to understand what helps kids succeed in school, succeed in life. What can we do to build resilience, to promote success in children who have experienced things like homelessness or coming out of war zones? And there's something very hopeful about being involved in the process that's focused on, recovery and resilience. It can be very difficult at sometimes, but I try to keep a focus on what we're trying to do.
Do you have any sense of whether the children of today are uh, better prepared for adversity than children born, let's say, during World War II or something like that? We have someone who was questioning this. They said they were born in 1943, and just curious about that.
That's a really good question. Um, that comes up a lot. The question, implicitly a question about, are we giving kids enough experience now with learning how to deal, are we, as I mentioned when I was giving my talk, you have to have some experiences of overcoming adversity. And are we in modern societies kind of overdoing it on protecting our children? It's a good question. Were kids more independent at other times in history? Do kids need more support now? I don't know. I think each era has different kinds of vulnerabilities and protections. But I think it's tough right now because people are juggling a lot of work and home issues. There's a lot of poverty. But I think things change over time. There are periods of high risk and vulnerability all the way through history. So I think that's a tough one to answer, but I think people have been concerned about things like overprotection of children. Parents and teachers too have a delicate task. They constantly have to figure out how much how much challenge is good and positive and how much is too much. You want your kids to experience enough challenge that they learn how to handle it, feel comfortable and confident that they can handle it. You don't want them to be, on the other hand, overwhelmed with
Right.
challenges. And, I think in some ways, when I was growing up, kids were kind of like free range in those days. I was growing up in the 50s. We kind of went off on our own as soon as we were old enough to do so, played all day and came home. That was, the way things worked. But there was a lot of parents at home at that time, particularly mothers, who were kind of keeping an eye on things. It was a different era than it is now. So I just think that any time in culture and history and circumstances, what you need to do for kids is going to be changing. I think right now, the media issues we have, social media, and the challenges that are coming up with artificial intelligence and kids spending a lot of time online, and the sort of some kids disconnecting from actual human contact in person or not having much time outside in nature, I think those are problematic. So, each era has different risks and vulnerabilities and protective factors that come and go into play.
Okay, are you aware of any studies that are looking at perhaps links between childhood trauma, the things that you've listed, homelessness, etc., and diseases, for example, autoimmune diseases?
There's that's not my area of specialty, but there is quite a bit of evidence that there are physical health consequences of adversity, and particularly children exposed to what they sometimes this is described as toxic stress, meaning high stress levels with very little protection. And, it's not manageable stress. So kids who are experiencing a lot of violence or neglect or, you know, all kinds of things, if you have a lot of exposure to adversity early in life, that can affect brain development. It can affect how your immune system works. It can affect your stress regulation system. But it's the combination of really high adversity and not enough protection, not enough, too little protection in your life. But it can have long-term effects. The other thing, there's a real interest in physical health impact of negative life experiences. But we also need at the same time to understand, if you have negative life experiences, what protects your health? And there's a lot of research going on about that right now. There's a lot of interest in, and there's a lot of work in pediatrics. Pediatrics is the pediatricians are like the front line in many ways on health, and they're getting very invested in what can we do because of the root we see kids routinely early in life, and they obviously are involved in things like vaccines and what can you do to take good care of your child's health. But they're also, one of the most effective public health interventions pediatricians have gotten into is this program called Reach Out and Read. It's very widespread here in the Twin Cities. In pediatrician offices, they give out books to parents with young children. Give them a book every time they come for their well baby visit, a book appropriate developmentally, and encourage parents to interact with their children around these books. That's based on a lot of research on child development and what makes a difference for kids. And it's very powerful. I think of the Sesame Workshop, which has produced early childhood programming for high-risk children around the world. They produce programming for military kids, deployed military, for kids in war zones. They're really kind of a global protective factor in the work they do, not just the regular Sesame Street show, but the work they've done to try to bring an understanding of research about executive function skills, about trauma, about, how to feel better when you're sad. They've done a lot of work like that in the media, and they have a lot of creative expertise on how to do that, how to get messaging across to children. So, I think there's a lot that could be done with a public health lens because so many of the protective factors that you see on the short list, for example, work for everybody, you know. And so, what can we do to strengthen those? I mean, part of what we do as families and schools is nurture the capacity for resilience, not only in our individual skills, how to solve problems, how to find help, but also how to get along with people and build the social support that is going to be important throughout life.
Oh, well said. One of our participants said that there was a slide that you had which had the words saw violence on it. So I'm thinking maybe one of the slides listing the different traumatic factors in a child's life. And the participant is wondering what are some examples of that saw violence. Is that just, any kind of
Early violence. There's direct observation in war zones. Um, Witnessing violence in a war zone is extremely scary to kids. Of course, receiving violence is horrible also, but kids have seen horrible things in war zones. And some of my early work, I'm gonna end the slideshow here and the sharing so I can see people better, see you better. Um, in some of my early work on children of war, Minnesota has a lot of refugees from war zones. And I did some early work with the Cambodian refugees who were survived the killing fields. And many of them came to Minnesota from refugee camps in Thailand. But we had a big resettlement in this area, as people may know, of Khmer people, some unaccompanied minors and some families and kids. But we did a research at the invitation of the Khmer community on, you know, what could we do to foster better outcomes in the youth? And they approached us, me and other people at the university, because they were concerned about youth. And the university was involved in helping to establish the Khmer Youth Leadership Program, getting kids involved in positive, helpful leadership activities. It can be very helpful. But when we did the research on the Cambodian survivors, by the time we met them, the Khmer Rouge was 75 to 79, 1979. They had been in refugee camps. The survivors who came here were often teenagers and young adults. And we did studies of their experiences carefully. You have to be careful what you put on a questionnaire from people who've been that traumatized. But their life events, many of the young people who were in Cambodia saw people tortured, were tortured themselves, saw people killed, including their families, were put into work groups. They saw horrible things during the Khmer period of the Khmer Rouge. And then we also measured their post-traumatic symptoms. And these are all the resilient group. The people who made it to Minnesota were doing remarkably well given what they had experienced as kids. But there was a relationship between having trauma symptoms, even this is like years later from having seen this kind of violence. But we could see that exposure to violence and extreme trauma like that has residual effects. And yet people were showing resilience in many of the ways you would hope for. They were going to school and doing well and coming to the University of Minnesota and carrying on with their lives. But it was, we followed people over time. So it was noticeable when war would break out on television, like the Gulf War or something like that, they would have symptoms. They become symptomatic again. It'd be temporary, but the memories would be triggered by what they saw in the media. So it was clear there were some lasting effects. There's also very good research indicating that extreme violence in war zones is a particularly devastating impact on kids. So kids not only who've been involved in something like the genocide in Cambodia, but also kids who were kidnapped in Africa as child soldiers.
Mm.
Some of those kids were not only exposed to extreme violence, they were forced to perpetrate extreme violence. It's very, very harmful. Yet, recovery is possible, but it's not easy. And that book on the list about the boy soldier was an example of somebody who recovered, but it's not easy to recover from that. So, but the same thing is true with child maltreatment. Extreme violence is very harmful, whether it's directed at you or you're observing it, or you're in an environment. In some violence is in neighborhoods. Just constant. That can make you have to deal with constant vigilance just to stay alive. That kind of violence is really harmful to development. And one of the things, if you look at the list of protective factors, I was thinking about that today as I was monitoring what's going on with wars around the world. Um, but war is extremely destructive. It undermines a lot of the protective systems that are important for child development. If you think about what does a war do? I mean, it like destroys all the systems that are supporting normal development. You're displaced, your schools wiped out, you're displaced, you're living in constant fear from bombs, you're in shelters, sometimes your parents are killed, you're separated from them. Wars are particularly horrible in their effects on child development. Preventing war is clearly the way to go, but it is possible to recover. I mean, we saw amazing recovery. It's also possible to have recurring post-traumatic symptoms, even though you're doing pretty darn well. I mean,
Mhm.
you're, living your life and making a living and taking care of your own family and so forth. Um, so there are some beautiful books and other things, documentaries and movies about recovery, even from awful situations like child soldiers and genocide survivors. It is possible to recover. And sometimes it helps kids a lot to be able to help others. Helping, it gives you a good sense of control to have opportunities to help out, help other people.
I can't recall the book I finished reading about a year ago, but it was about the people who are still trying to repair their lives in Rwanda from
Yeah.
those tragedies and what that was like for them to see their fellow citizens being hacked to death and being
Oh,
told that they
horrible.
had to do that too to their
Right,
neighbors.
right.
And it was just absolutely appalling. I imagine that a lot of what you're talking about can be applied to adults who witness trauma
Totally.
and experience homelessness and
Yeah.
all the factors you listed.
Right. Well, there are other people who've specialized in resilience in aging. And it's just, you see a lot of the same protective factors. They just take them a tour form. It's like a later version. But speaking of Rwanda, there's a beautiful paper by Chevelle and Denov, a paper about three generations of effects. It's on risk and resilience, but they have a resilience model. They've studied three generations of survivors in Rwanda and the effects of the intergenerational effects of rape and the other atrocities in Rwanda. But it's focused on resilience, and it's important that we learn and from people who are willing to share their experiences of in that way.
I apologize that I may have missed this in your talk, but you did mention that people are studying what makes some children able to manage and be resilient through these multiple disasters that they experience while others aren't. And what were some of the factors that led to children being able to be resilient?
Well, there were the ordinary magic list. They're like having supportive families,
Ah,
people looking out for you, um,
okay.
being able to sustain your hope,
Yeah.
having opportunities. And it's really, you can see these at work if you, um, you know, observe or visit or learn about refugee camps, if you see people in the aftermath of war, even in the MOOC discussions, people talk about what made a difference for them. And in those, what people recount, it's often people supporting them, it's their faith. There's many, it's not one thing, there are multiple influences that help people make it. And we can support those. And, humanitarian agencies do a really nice job with trying to support that, to make it possible for people to feel a sense of control, empower people, to provide opportunities. One of the most interesting experiences I ever had visiting a war-torn country, we were visiting Jordan, and I was with a group from the National Academies, and we wanted to meet with young people from a refugee camp, but we didn't want to intrude on them. We didn't want to visit the camp. So we invited them to come to a meeting with us, and they were on a panel, young people, and we asked them, well, what would be most helpful to you? And it was really striking to me. They answered, well, we need a good internet connection and and some opportunities for education, and then we'll take care of the rest. They wanted the tools to do something on their own, and they were older adolescents. They wanted to have the tools that they needed to connect with people, to get an education, to find work, and so forth. So,
I love that you titled those kind of interventions ordinary magic. I think that's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. It makes all the sense in the world. Um, Probably only have time for this one last question that just popped in, and I think it's a great way to end our time together.
okay.
Do you use the ideas of Viktor Frankl in regard to your work, Man's Search for Meaning?
Yes, of course. Well, of course, he's an icon of understanding what makes a difference. And you know, meaning and purpose has always been on the short list or has always been talked about. I mean, obviously, Viktor Frankl brought that subject up to millions of people. His book is still selling millions of copies
Yes.
around
Yeah.
the world. Um, but the search for meaning, and there's another book that I had listed. There's a book by a Cambodian girl that is called To Destroy You Is No Loss. She describes, she was a teenager during the killing fields period, the Khmer Rouge, and she was in a work camp. And one of her friends got killed by being raped and harmed. And so all the other girls in the work group started carrying around poison because they thought, well, I'll kill myself before I let this happen. But she describes in this book an epiphany she had and it reminded me so much of Viktor Frankl's description in the concentration camp, where everybody is looking at the sky, at this beautiful sunset that's reflected in the mud puddles in the concentration camp. And they're just struck by the beauty of it. And she realized she was looking at the sky and suddenly realized, you know what? The Khmer Rouge do not control when the sun comes up or goes down. Um, and I'm not going to let them destroy me. And she decides to make it. She decides to survive and does eventually get out of there and get to a refugee camp. But, these epiphanies of sort of, trying to discover, understand what can I do in the middle of a terrible situation. Some of them are spiritual, some of them are a sense of purpose and meaning. Some of them are just being able to directly experiencing something beautiful that's out of the control of the tormentors in a concentration camp or in a war zone. But yes, Viktor Frankl was very influential.
Oh, thank you so much for that. We are so sadly out of time today. While I do my concluding remarks here, though, I want to point our attendees back to the chat feature. I know I talked you out of using the chat feature in the beginning, but now I want you to go back and look in the chat itself way towards the beginning. That's where you'll find the links to the documents that Dr. Masten has been referring to that have the list of books and documentaries and other resources for you. So quickly go to the chat, scroll way up to the beginning, and you'll find the links to those handouts. So thank you again, Dr. Masten. This was eye-opening for me, and I'm sure for our audience. Thank you also to the audience. You are, as always, brilliant with your questions, and I am always so sorry I can't get to all of them. If we could just keep this program going for another 3 hours, we could get to them. Thank you to OLLI, and thank you to our sponsor, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Please join us next week for the next presentation in our series entitled Immunotherapy, a Game Changer for Cancer Patients, with our perennial favorite, Dr. Christopher Pennell, presenting. And so thank you again. We will hope to see all of you then. Thank you so much.